1960s in America was a decade of profound social, cultural, and technological change. For children growing up during this era, daily life was shaped by these broader societal shifts, as well as by the unique characteristics of the decade. As we explore a typical day in the life of a 1960s American child, we'll uncover not just the routines and activities that define their experiences, but also the underlying factors that influence their world, from the civil rights movement to the space race, from the British invasion to the Vietnam War. The day for a typical 1960s child often began around 7 a.m., much like in the previous decade. However, there were subtle shifts in morning routines. With more mothers entering the workforce, some children were waking up to alarm clocks rather than being roused by a parent. This change reflected the gradual shift in family dynamics and gender roles that was occurring throughout the decade. Breakfast in the 1960s saw the continued rise of convenient packaged foods. While traditional fare like eggs and toast remained popular, cereals marketed directly to children gained even more prominence. The introduction of sugary cereals like Cap'n Crunch, 1963, and Fruit Loops, 1966, reflected the growing influence of television advertising on children's diets. This trend would later spark debates about nutrition and marketing ethics. After breakfast, children prepared for school. Dress codes in many schools were becoming slightly more relaxed compared to the 1950s, reflecting the decade's growing emphasis on individual expression. Boys might wear jeans more frequently, while girls' skirt lengths were rising. However, many schools still maintained fairly strict standards, creating tension between traditional expectations and the decade's push for greater personal freedom. The journey to school in the 1960s varied depending on location, much like in the previous decade. However, there were some shifts. The continued growth of suburbs meant more children were being bused to school. In some urban areas, busing was implemented as a means of school desegregation, a controversial policy that reflected the decade's civil rights struggles. These changes in school transportation were reshaping children's daily experiences and social interactions. School in the 1960s was undergoing significant changes. Class sizes were often large due to the baby boom, but new educational philosophies were gaining traction. The concept of open classrooms began to emerge, emphasizing student-directed learning and less rigid structures. While not universally adopted, these new approaches reflected broader societal questioning of traditional authority structures. The curriculum in 1960s schools was evolving. There was a renewed emphasis on science and mathematics, spurred by Cold War competition and the space race. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 had shocked Americans, leading to increased funding and focus on these subjects throughout the 1960s. This shift reflected the nation's determination to lead in technological advancement and its impact on educational priorities. Social studies classes in the 1960s began to incorporate more discussion of current events. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and other major events of the decade were making their way into classrooms, often leading to spirited debates. This integration of current affairs into the curriculum reflected the decade's social upheavals and the increasing awareness that children had of the world around them. Physical education remained an important part of the school day. The President's Council on Physical Fitness, established under Eisenhower and expanded by Kennedy, continued to promote physical activity in schools. However, there was a growing emphasis on sports and games over the regimented calisthenics of the 1950s. This shift reflected a more holistic approach to fitness and a recognition of the social benefits of team sports. Lunchtime in 1960s schools saw the continued expansion of school cafeteria programs. The variety of foods offered was increasing, though nutrition standards were not as stringent as they would become in later decades. For many children, school lunch was a social highlight of the day, a time to chat with friends and trade items from lunchboxes featuring popular TV shows or musical groups, reflecting the growing youth culture of the era. Recess remained an important part of the school day, providing children with unstructured time for play and socialization. Traditional games like jump rope and tag continued to be popular, but new playground equipment was also being introduced in many schools. Innovations like the geodesic dome climber, inspired by the designs of Buckminster Fuller, reflected the decade's fascination with futuristic and space-age concepts. After school, many children in the 1960s participated in organized activities. Sports leagues, scout programs, and music lessons remained popular. However, there was a growing trend towards more diverse after-school options, including science clubs, reflecting the decade's emphasis on technical education. These activities often mixed educational goals with social opportunities, shaping children's skills and peer groups. For children who didn't have after-school activities, the hours after school were often spent in less structured play. In many neighborhoods, especially in suburban areas, children enjoyed significant freedom to roam and play outdoors until dinner time. This independence, while beginning to decrease compared to previous decades, still contrasts sharply with the more supervised childhoods of later eras. Television played an increasingly central role in children's after-school routines during the 1960s. With color TV becoming more common, children's programming expanded and became more vibrant. Shows like The Flintstones and The Jetsons captivated young audiences, offering entertainment while subtly reflecting societal views on family life and technological progress. The growing role of TV in children's lives was beginning to reshape leisure time and cultural touchstones. Homework loads were generally increasing in the 1960s compared to the previous decade, reflecting heightened academic expectations. The space race and international academic competitions fueled concerns about American students falling behind, leading to more rigorous academic standards. This trend reflected broader societal anxieties about national competitiveness in the global arena. Dinner time in many 1960s households remained a family affair, but changing social norms were beginning to impact this tradition. With more mothers working outside the home, convenience foods and TV dinners became more common. The TV was increasingly present during meals in some households, beginning to alter family dynamics and mealtime conversations. After dinner, family activities often centered around television viewing. Popular shows like The Andy Griffith Show or Bonanza became shared family experiences. However, the generation gap was widening, with many children and teenagers developing different tastes in entertainment from their parents. This divergence in cultural consumption reflected the growing youth culture and the societal changes of the decade. Music played an increasingly important role in children's lives during the 1960s. The British invasion, led by the Beatles, transformed popular music and youth culture. Many children and teenagers spent their evenings listening to records or the radio, often to their parents' chagrin. This generational divide in musical tastes was emblematic of the broader cultural shifts occurring throughout the decade. Bedtime routines in the 1960s were generally similar to those of the previous decade, but there were subtle shifts. Some children were staying up later, especially to watch evening TV programs. The growing influence of youth culture was beginning to impact even these domestic routines, as children increasingly asserted their own preferences. Weekends in the 1960s offered children a break from school routines. Saturday morning cartoons became a cultural institution during this decade, with many children waking up early to watch their favorite animated shows. This shared experience among children across the country created a kind of national childhood culture, influenced heavily by television. Weekend activities often included family outings, The continued expansion of the interstate highway system and increasing car ownership made day trips and weekend getaways more accessible. Visits to amusement parks, national parks, or historic sites were popular, reflecting the increasing mobility of American families and the growing emphasis on leisure activities. Sports played a significant role in many children's weekends. Little League Baseball, which had grown rapidly in the 1950s, continued to be popular. Other organized sports were also gaining traction, with soccer beginning to emerge as a popular youth sport by the end of the decade. These activities reflected the continued emphasis on physical fitness and the social importance of sports in American culture. The civil rights movement had a profound impact on many children's lives in the 1960s. School desegregation meant that some children were experiencing more diverse classroom environments for the first time. For African American children, the decade brought both new opportunities and ongoing challenges. These experiences shaped many children's understanding of race, equality, and social justice. The space race captured the imagination of many children in the 1960s. The Mercury and Gemini programs, followed by the Apollo missions, made astronauts into national heroes. Many children dreamed of space travel, collected space-themed toys, and followed NASA missions closely. This fascination reflected the nation's technological optimism and the cultural impact of the space program. Cold War tensions continued to influence children's lives in the 1960s. Air raid drills in schools were common, especially in the early part of the decade. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the threat of nuclear war into sharp focus. While many children may not have fully understood these issues, they contributed to an underlying sense of anxiety that was characteristic of the era. Environmental awareness began to grow among children in the 1960s. The publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962 sparked public concern about pollution and environmental degradation. By the end of the decade, the first Earth Day was on the horizon. This growing environmental consciousness would shape many children's worldviews and future activism. The rise of counterculture in the mid to late 1960s had a trickle-down effect on many children, especially those with older siblings. New fashions, music, and ideas associated with the hippie movement began to influence youth culture more broadly. While most children were too young to fully participate in the counterculture, its impact on society affected their daily lives and perceptions. Technology was advancing rapidly in the 1960s, and children were often at the forefront of embracing new gadgets. Transistor radios became popular, allowing kids to listen to music wherever they went. The introduction of the audio cassette near the end of the decade revolutionized how music was consumed and shared. These technological changes were empowering children with more control over their cultural consumption. Gender roles were beginning to shift in the 1960s, impacting children's experiences and expectations. The women's movement was gaining momentum, challenging traditional notions of gender. While change was gradual, many girls were starting to envision broader possibilities for their futures. Boys, too, were beginning to see shifts in expectations about masculinity and future roles. The Vietnam War loomed large in American society during the 1960s, affecting children in various ways. Older siblings or young uncles being drafted made the war a personal reality for many. Anti-war protests became common, especially later in the decade, exposing many children to political activism. The war's presence on nightly news broadcasts brought international conflicts into American living rooms as never before. Popular culture was evolving rapidly in the 1960s, and children were avid consumers. Comic books remained popular, but superhero narratives were becoming more complex. Movies and television increasingly tackled more mature themes. This evolution in media reflected and contributed to changing perceptions of childhood and what was considered appropriate for young audiences. Toys and games in the 1960s reflected the era's focus on space and technology. Chemistry sets and erector sets fed into the emphasis on science education. New toys like the Easy Bake Oven, introduced in 1963, reflected changing domestic dynamics. The increasing sophistication of toys mirrored broader technological advancements and changing perceptions of childhood development. Religious and moral education remained important for many children in the 1960s, but it was also a time of questioning traditional values. The decade saw the emergence of new spiritual movements and a growing interest in Eastern philosophies. For many children, this period marked the beginning of a more pluralistic approach to religion and spirituality in American society. The concept of adolescence continued to evolve in the 1960s. The term teenager became firmly entrenched in the cultural lexicon, with marketers increasingly targeting this age group. For younger children, the teenage years were often seen as a desirable future state, associated with greater freedom and cultural cash. This focus on youth culture was reshaping societal notions of childhood and maturation. Health and safety standards were evolving in the 1960s. Awareness of the dangers of smoking was growing, though many children still saw their parents smoke. Car safety was improving with the introduction of seatbelts, but their use was not yet widespread or mandated. These changes reflected growing societal concern with public health and safety, though implementation was often gradual. The role of fathers in children's daily lives was slowly changing during the 1960s. While the breadwinner model remained dominant, there was a growing emphasis on fathers' involvement in child rearing. This shift, though gradual, reflected changing ideas about gender roles and family dynamics that would accelerate in subsequent decades. School integration was a significant issue in many communities during the 1960s. For some children, particularly in the South, this decade marked their first experiences in racially integrated schools. These experiences, while often challenging, played a crucial role in shaping a generation's views on race and equality. The arts were flourishing in the 1960s, and many children benefited from increased emphasis on artistic education. School music and art programs were often well-funded, reflecting the decade's broader cultural vibrancy. Exposure to diverse artistic expressions, from pop art to avant-garde music, was expanding many children's cultural horizons. Outdoor play remained a significant part of childhood in the 1960s, but it was beginning to change. Concerns about safety were gradually leading to more supervised play. The introduction of new playground equipment reflected both safety concerns and the era's space-age aesthetic. These changes marked the beginning of a shift towards more structured and supervised outdoor activities for children. The fast food industry was growing rapidly in the 1960s, changing children's eating habits and expectations. McDonald's and other chains were expanding, offering novel experiences for many children. While not an everyday occurrence for most, visits to these restaurants were often seen as special treats. This trend reflected broader changes in American food culture and family dining habits. As we reflect on childhood in 1960s America, we see a world in transition. The relative stability and conformity of the 1950s was giving way to a more dynamic and sometimes turbulent social landscape. Children of this era were exposed to rapid technological advancements, significant social movements, and changing family dynamics. They witnessed and participated in a society grappling with issues of war, civil rights, environmental concerns, and cultural upheaval. The daily life of a 1960s child was shaped by these forces, creating experiences that were in many ways distinct from both previous and subsequent generations. The legacy of 1960s childhood continues to influence American culture and society. Many of the changes that began or accelerated in this decade, from shifting gender roles to environmental awareness, from the dominance of television to the questioning of authority, would profoundly shape the adults these children would become. Understanding the experiences of children during this transformative decade provides valuable insights into the evolution of American society. It reminds us of the complex interplay between individual experiences and broader historical currents, and how the seeds of future change are often sown in the seemingly mundane aspects of daily life. As we look back on this era, we gain a deeper appreciation for how childhood experiences both reflect and shape the world around them, continuing to resonate through subsequent generations.